Love doesn't die with a grand explosion. It doesn't come crashing down all at once. No, it fades, slowly, quietly, until one day, you look at the person beside you and realize you don't recognize them anymore. For me, that realization hit like a freight train on what was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life. I had spent weeks planning our 10th anniversary dinner, making sure every little detail was perfect. It wasn't about anything flashy or expensive. I just wanted the night to feel special, to remind us both of the life we had built together. I booked a table at the restaurant where we had our first real date, a place that held years of memories for us. I even wrote Lorna a letter, pouring my heart onto the page, telling her everything I still felt after all this time. I showed up early, the letter tucked neatly into my jacket pocket. I had ordered her favorite wine, the one she always said tasted like summer, and asked for a table with a quiet view of the city lights. I was nervous, but in a good way. Excited. Hopeful. Then she walked in. For a brief moment, everything felt right. She looked beautiful, just like she always did, her auburn hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She smiled when she saw me, and I felt that familiar warmth in my chest, the same one I had felt a decade ago when she first said my name. But before she reached our table, something happened. She stopped, and then she laughed. Not just any laugh, the kind that made her throw her head back slightly, the kind that came from deep inside her, unguarded and real. The kind I hadn't heard in a long time. And it wasn't for me. I followed her gaze and saw him. A man sitting at the bar, leaning in slightly as he spoke to her. She didn't just respond, she engaged. She tucked her hair behind her ear the way she always did when she was nervous. She touched his arm lightly, playfully, like a reflex. And then I heard it. Flirting. Effortless. Natural. As if she had done it 1,000 times before. As if I wasn't even there. The world around me dimmed. The restaurant's soft music became a distant hum, the clinking of silverware and quiet conversations fading into nothing. All I could hear was her voice, the way it lifted, teasing, inviting. A tone I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I should have stood up. I should have walked over, confronted her, said something. But instead, I sat frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs, my fingers tightening around the letter I had written for her. The words inside it suddenly felt pathetic. She finally turned and saw me. For a second, her smile faltered. A flicker of something crossed her face, shock, maybe even guilt. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a forced smile as she walked toward me. "Hey, sorry, I got caught up talking to someone from work," she said casually, sliding into the seat across from me as if nothing had happened. I looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment, I knew. Something between us had already died, and I had been the last one to notice. But I wasn't going to let her see me break. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the envelope, and slid it across the table toward her. "Happy anniversary," I said. Then, before she could respond, before I could change my mind, I stood up and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind 10 years of my life at that table. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back. The night air felt different when I stepped outside. Colder, heavier, like the weight of the past 10 years was pressing down on me all at once. My hands were in my pockets, fingers curled into fists around nothing, gripping at the emptiness where I once held certainty. I had walked out without making a scene, without letting her see the storm building inside me. But my heart was pounding, and every step away from that restaurant felt like stepping into an unknown future I hadn't prepared for. I reached my car and leaned against it, staring at the glow of the city lights in the distance. The sounds of the street were normal, laughter from people walking by, the honk of a car, the hum of distant conversations. All of it was so ordinary, and yet my entire world had just been knocked off its axis. I kept replaying it in my head. The way she laughed. The way she touched his arm, that small, meaningless gesture that suddenly felt like the most significant thing in the world. The way she had looked at me when she finally noticed I was there, not with the warmth I had hoped for, not even with surprise, but with something that felt dangerously close to regret. Like she wished I hadn't seen. Like I wasn't supposed to be a part of that moment. I thought about walking back in, sitting down, letting her explain, because that's what people in long-term marriages do, right? They work through things. They communicate. They don't just walk away over a moment that could have been nothing. But my gut told me otherwise. She had already been slipping away. I just hadn't wanted to see it. I opened the car door but didn't get in. Instead, I sat on the edge of the seat, staring down at the pavement, my mind spiraling through a decade of memories. Our wedding day. The night we moved into our first tiny apartment, eating cold pizza on the floor because we didn't have a dining table yet. The way she used to reach for my hand when she was nervous, the way she used to look at me like I was the only person in the room. When had that changed? Had it been gradual? A slow erosion of love that I had ignored because I wanted to believe we were still the same people? Or had she been pretending, going through the motions while secretly craving something else, someone else? A soft vibration in my pocket pulled me out of my thoughts. My phone. Her name on the screen. I didn't answer. I sat there and watched as it rang, as the call ended, as a new message appeared. Lorna, where did you go? A part of me wanted to text back something cutting, something that would make her feel even a fraction of what I was feeling in that moment. But another part of me was too exhausted for that. I wasn't even angry, just hollow. She called again. I let it ring. And then another message. Lorna, are you mad? Babe, it was nothing. Please come back inside. Nothing. I clenched my jaw. If it had been nothing, then why did my entire body feel like it had been dropped into ice water the second I saw her with him? If it had been nothing, why was she trying so hard to explain before I even said a word? I took a deep breath and finally started my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the weight of my emotions pressing against my ribs like a vice. I could have gone home. I could have sat on our couch, waiting for her to return, pretending like we could just talk this through. I could have been the understanding husband, the forgiving man who gives his wife the benefit of the doubt. Instead, I started driving. Not home. Not anywhere in particular. Just away. Away from the restaurant. Away from her messages. Away from the life that suddenly felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. As the city lights blurred past me, one thought kept circling in my mind, over and over like a whisper I couldn't ignore. What if I had been blind this entire time? What if I was the only one still holding on? I drove for hours. No music, no destination, just the hum of the engine and the endless road stretching out before me. The city lights eventually faded behind me, replaced by the quiet of the open highway. Somewhere along the way, I pulled into a gas station, not because I needed fuel, but because I needed a moment to breathe. I stepped out of the car, the crisp night air hitting me as I leaned against the door. My phone was still vibrating every few minutes, a relentless reminder of the world I had walked away from. Messages. Calls. Each one a tether, trying to pull me back into a reality I wasn't ready to face. I finally opened the messages, scrolling through them with a growing sense of detachment. Lorna, where are you? Lorna, come on, stop acting weird. It was nothing. Lorna, are you seriously mad? I was just talking. Lorna, come home. We need to talk. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. What was I supposed to say? That I wasn't mad? That I wasn't hurt? That the image of her leaning into another man, laughing like she used to laugh with me, wasn't burned into my brain like a scar I'd never be able to erase? I shoved my phone back into my pocket and walked into the gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a dull, artificial glow. A middle-aged cashier barely looked up from his magazine as I grabbed a bottle of water and some painkillers. My head was pounding. As I paid, I caught my reflection in the convex security mirror behind the counter. I barely recognized myself. My eyes were tired, my shoulders slumped, my face hollow with something I couldn't quite name. Was this what 10 years of marriage had led me to? Standing in a gas station at midnight, avoiding my wife because I didn't know how to face what I had just seen? I got back into the car and just sat there for a while, my fingers tapping absently against the steering wheel. My mind kept looping through a single, suffocating thought. Had I been a fool all this time? Because the truth was, this wasn't the first time I had felt something was off. There had been moments. Small things. The way she'd been more distant lately, always distracted, her phone never far from her hand. The late nights at work that never seemed to add up. The way she had stopped reaching for me in bed. How she would turn away just as I moved closer. I had told myself it was stress. Work, life, responsibilities, all the things that pile up over the years. I convinced myself that it was just a phase, that every marriage had ups and downs. But sitting there in my car, staring at the gas station lights, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. That moment at the restaurant wasn't just some misunderstanding. It was a crack in the foundation of something I had believed was solid. And now that I had seen it, I couldn't unsee it. I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming out in slow, measured exhales. I had two choices. I could go home. Pretend none of this happened. Let her explain it away. Let her reassure me. Let myself believe that I was just overreacting. Or I could finally face the truth. The truth that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. That the woman I had built a life with might have already moved on, even if she hadn't admitted it out loud. The weight of that realization settled over me like a heavy fog. For 10 years, I had been the man who believed in us, in our love, in the promises we made. But now? Now, I wasn't so sure. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the gas station, but I didn't head home. Not yet. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The house we built together, the bed we shared, the walls that had heard our whispered dreams late into the night, none of it felt like mine anymore. Not after tonight. Instead, I kept driving. I didn't have a destination in mind, but I wasn't ready to face her. Not yet. Not when my mind was still replaying the moment at the restaurant like a cruel, never-ending loop. After what felt like hours, I pulled into the empty parking lot of a 24-hour diner. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dull glow onto the wet pavement. I had no appetite, but I needed a place to sit, to think, to exist somewhere outside of the suffocating silence of my car. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The place was nearly deserted, save for a lone trucker hunched over his coffee at the counter and a waitress who looked like she had been on her feet for far too many hours. She glanced up from behind the register, barely registering me before going back to wiping down the counter. I slid into a booth in the far corner, my back against the wall, facing the door. Old habits. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I was already settled, my hands folded in front of me. A few moments later, the waitress shuffled over, her pen already poised over her notepad. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," I muttered. She nodded, scribbled something down, and walked away. No small talk. No forced pleasantries. Just silence. And for once, I appreciated it. I stared at the condensation forming on the window, my mind spiraling in too many directions at once. The weight in my chest hadn't lessened. If anything, it had only grown heavier. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and stared at the unread messages. "Lorna, are you coming home? Lorna, you're really making a big deal out of nothing. Lorna, I don't know what you think you saw, but it wasn't what you're making it out to be. Lorna, please, just talk to me." I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over my face. I could feel it, the shift. The way she was already trying to control the narrative, making it seem like I was the one overreacting. Like I was the one turning a casual conversation into something it wasn't. But she hadn't seen what I had seen. She hadn't seen the way her body naturally leaned into his. The way her fingers lightly traced the rim of her wine glass as she spoke. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear like she used to do when we were first dating, nervous but excited. She hadn't seen the way her entire face lit up, not with the warmth of a friend catching up, but with something more. Something I hadn't been on the receiving end of in a very, very long time. The waitress returned, setting a steaming mug of coffee in front of me. I murmured a quiet thank you, wrapping my hands around the ceramic, letting the warmth seep into my skin. I thought about calling her, about demanding answers, about giving her the chance to explain. But then what? Would she tell me what I wanted to hear? Would she apologize, make promises, swear it was all in my head? Would she turn it around, make me feel like I was the one seeing things that weren't there? And if she did, would I believe her? I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding me for a brief moment. I used to think love was unbreakable, that when two people committed to each other, they fought for what they had, no matter what. That's what marriage was supposed to be, right? A promise that no matter how hard things got, no matter how much time passed, you still chose each other. But what happens when one person stops choosing? I wasn't naive. People drift apart. Feelings change. But when had she stopped seeing me the way she once did? When had I stopped being the man she turned to first? When had I become nothing more than a fixture in her life, someone she could place neatly in the background while she reached for something new, something exciting? I had spent years believing in us, believing in the idea that we would always find our way back to each other. But now, I wasn't so sure. I stared down at my phone one last time before finally typing out a response. I'm not coming home tonight. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned my phone over, face down on the table, and took another slow sip of coffee. For the first time in a long time, I let myself sit in the silence. I didn't check my phone after that. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what would come next, more messages, more missed calls, and then the inevitable shift from concern to frustration. Lorna never handled silence well. She liked to be in control of the conversation, to dictate how things unfolded. But tonight, she had lost that power. I sat in the diner long after my coffee had gone cold, staring at the clock above the counter as the minutes bled into hours. The trucker had left. The waitress had refilled my cup twice without a word, and still, I stayed. I wasn't avoiding her. Not exactly. I was avoiding what came next. I wasn't stupid. I knew there were only two roads ahead of me. Either I confronted her and demanded the truth, or I let this night be the moment I started walking away. But after 10 years, how do you walk away from someone who was once your whole world? I ran a hand down my face, exhaustion settling deep in my bones. My body wanted rest, but my mind was relentless, dragging me through a decade of memories with a cruel sort of precision. It was as if my brain wanted me to feel every single moment that had led me here. I remembered the first time I saw her. It was a random afternoon in spring, the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real. She had been standing in line at a coffee shop, her nose buried in a book, completely unaware of the world around her. I had been behind her, watching as she kept pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose every few seconds, completely engrossed in whatever she was reading. When she finally ordered, she spoke so quickly that the barista had to ask her to repeat herself twice. She laughed, embarrassed, and when she turned slightly, our eyes met. That was it. That was the moment I knew I wanted to know everything about her. It had been effortless back then. Easy. She had been soft in the ways that mattered, sharp in the ways that kept me on my toes. She had challenged me, made me better, made me feel like I was someone worth knowing. But people change. Or maybe they don't. Maybe they just become more of who they really are. I let out a slow breath, gripping my coffee cup as the weight of that thought settled in my chest. Was this who she had always been? Someone who needed attention, who thrived on validation from others. Had I just been too blind to see it before? Or had I been enough once? Had something shifted, some invisible line crossed, until suddenly, I wasn't what she wanted anymore? The thought made my stomach twist, a slow, nauseating churn that I couldn't shake. I finally reached for my phone, not because I wanted to, but because I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The screen was flooded with notifications. Lorna, what do you mean you're not coming home? Lorna, are you serious right now? Lorna, you're acting insane. Lorna, pick up the phone. Lorna, I swear, if you don't answer me, I'm coming to find you. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. Of course, she would. Of course, she couldn't just let me have a moment to process, to breathe. That wasn't how she worked. She needed to control the narrative, to make sure that whatever I was thinking, it was only what she allowed me to think. I didn't reply. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't dialed in a long, long time. Patrick. My best friend. Or at least, he had been, once. Before life got in the way. Before I let my marriage consume everything else, pushing away the people who had once meant the world to me. I hesitated for only a second before pressing call. It rang twice before he answered. Eli. His voice was groggy, thick with sleep. Man, do you have any idea what time it is? I swallowed hard. Yeah. Sorry. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. I didn't know who else to call. There was a pause. A long one. Then a rustling sound, like he was sitting up. What happened? And just like that, the dam broke. I told him everything. From the moment she walked into that restaurant, to the way she had laughed, to the way my entire world had cracked in half in a matter of seconds. I told him about the messages, about how I didn't know what was real anymore, about how I felt like I had been living in some kind of illusion for the past few years. Patrick listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't tell me I was overreacting. He just let me talk. When I finally stopped, there was another long pause. Then he sighed. Eli, I don't know how to say this, man, but maybe it's time to start asking yourself a hard question. I stared at the table in front of me, my throat tightening. What question? Another sigh. Then quietly. Is this really the first time? The words hit like a punch to the gut. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. And it terrified me. I didn't answer Patrick right away. How could I? The weight of his words settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup, its warmth doing little to chase away the cold creeping into my bones. Is this really the first time? It should have been an easy question to dismiss. I should have been able to scoff, shake my head, and tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't. Because deep down, in the darkest corner of my mind, the place I had been avoiding for far too long, I knew he had a point. Hadn't there been signs? Moments that I ignored, brushed off, convinced myself or nothing? I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly as the memories began to surface. There was that time last year when she had started working late more often. At first, it was once or twice a week, then 3, then 4. She always had an excuse: deadlines, meetings that ran over, last-minute projects. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Then there were the business trips. Lorna had never traveled much for work before, but suddenly, she was gone more frequently. The trips were always mandatory, always exhausting. She'd come home late, drop her suitcase by the door, and collapse into bed without so much as a goodnight kiss. And then there was her phone. It was always with her. Always face down on the counter, notifications silenced. If I so much as reached for it to check the time, she would snatch it back with a casual, "Work's been crazy. I just don't want to deal with it right now." But it wasn't work, was it? I had been blind. Or maybe I had just wanted to be blind. Because if I saw it, if I really let myself see what was happening, then I would have had to admit that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. Patrick's voice pulled me back to the present. "Eli? You still there?" I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Yeah." There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "Look, man, I know this isn't what you want to hear. But sometimes the hardest thing to face is the truth that's been in front of us all along." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. What do I even do? My voice was quieter than I intended. How do you even begin to walk away from 10 years? Another pause. Then Patrick said something that I would never forget. "You don't walk away from 10 years, Eli. You walk away from the person who made those 10 years a lie." The words hit like a gut punch. I had been holding on so tightly to the idea of our marriage, to the memories, to the promises. But what if I had been holding on to something that didn't exist anymore? Or worse, what if I had been holding on to something that had never existed in the first place? I ran a hand down my face, my skin feeling hot despite the coolness of the diner. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the past with the present, trying to understand how I had gotten here. "Eli," Patrick said carefully, "have you ever checked? I mean, actually looked? Bank statements, phone records, anything that doesn't add up?" The question made my stomach twist. Because I hadn't. Not once. I had trusted her. I had taken her words at face value, never questioning, never doubting. Because that's what love was, right? Trusting without needing proof. But now, sitting in this booth at a rundown diner, my whole world unraveling around me, I wasn't sure if that trust had been love or just willful ignorance. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from Lorna. It was a bank notification. A large transaction had just been made from our joint account. A withdrawal. $5,000. Gone. My pulse spiked, my fingers tightening around the phone. Patrick heard the shift in my breathing. "Eli? What is it?" I stared at the screen, my mind racing. She just took $5,000 out of our account. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, slowly, "Eli, where is she right now?" I didn't have an answer, but I needed to find out. The moment I saw that bank notification, my entire body went cold. $5,000. Gone in an instant. The number glowed on my screen like a warning sign, a beacon of something I had been too blind or too unwilling to see. I pushed my coffee aside, my hands gripping the edge of the table as I tried to steady my breathing. A part of me wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she was paying off a bill. Maybe she was covering an emergency expense I had forgotten about. But deep down, I knew better. Lorna had never withdrawn that much money at once, and she had never done it without telling me. Patrick's voice pulled me back. "Eli, you need to figure out where she is. Right now." I stood abruptly, throwing a few bills on the table before grabbing my keys. The waitress barely glanced up as I walked out, my mind racing. My car was parked under a flickering streetlight, the pavement wet from the earlier rain. I slid into the driver's seat, hands tightening around the wheel as I stared at my phone. I had a choice. I could drive home, wait for her, demand an explanation, or I could go looking for the truth myself. I unlocked my phone and went straight to the banking app, checking the transaction details. The withdrawal had been made from an ATM near a hotel downtown. My stomach twisted. Hotels, business trips, late nights. Had it all been leading to this moment? I pulled out of the diner parking lot, my heart pounding as I navigated the empty streets. The city looked different at this hour, quieter, darker, like it was holding secrets in the shadows. Every traffic light felt like a test of my patience, every second stretching out endlessly. When I reached the hotel, I parked across the street, turning off the engine. The building loomed in front of me, its golden lights casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. People came and went through the glass doors, dragging suitcases, laughing with friends, lost in their own worlds. And then I saw her. Lorna. She walked out of the lobby with purpose, her phone in one hand, a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't dressed for a business trip, no formal attire, no work bag. Instead, she wore jeans and a fitted top, her hair slightly tousled like she hadn't just stepped out of a meeting but from something else. I should have confronted her right then and there. I should have marched across the street, demanded answers, forced her to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. But I didn't. Instead, I watched as she glanced around quickly, as if checking to make sure no one saw her. Then she stepped toward the curb, and a car pulled up. Not a cab, not a rideshare. A personal car. The kind of car that belonged to someone who was waiting for her. The driver leaned over and pushed the door open for her. I couldn't see his face, but I could see hers. She smiled. That soft, intimate kind of smile. The kind of smile I hadn't seen in years. And just like that, she got in. The car pulled away, merging into traffic, disappearing down the street. I sat there, my grip so tight on the wheel that my knuckles turned white. She hadn't hesitated, hadn't looked back. She wasn't rushing home, worried about where I was. She wasn't calling me, trying to explain the missing money. Because she wasn't thinking about me at all. I exhaled slowly, my breath shaking as I forced myself to process what I had just seen. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. And she had made it long before I had even realized. I sat there in my car, watching the red taillights of the car carrying my wife. No, not my wife. Not anymore, fade into the distance. The moment felt surreal, like I was standing outside of my own life, watching it crumble in real time. But as the seconds passed, something strange happened. I didn't feel the rage I expected. I didn't feel the crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest, threatening to pull me under. I just felt free. For the first time in years, I wasn't fighting for something that didn't exist. I wasn't holding on to a version of Lorna that had died a long time ago. I wasn't making excuses, turning a blind eye, or pretending that things would get better if I just tried harder. She had made her choice. And now, I was making mine. I took a deep breath and let go of the wheel, flexing my stiff fingers. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. Whatever excuse, whatever lie she was crafting, I didn't need to hear it. I didn't need an explanation for something that was already so painfully clear. I turned the key in the ignition, but instead of driving home to an empty house filled with broken promises, I drove somewhere else. Somewhere I hadn't been in a long time. Patrick's place. When I knocked on his door, he opened it within seconds, his face tight with concern. But before he could say anything, I gave him a small, tired smile. You were right, I admitted. I was the last one to know. Patrick exhaled, nodding as he stepped aside, letting me in. So, what now? That was the question, wasn't it? What now? I thought about my life, the life I had been so afraid of losing. And for the first time, I realized I hadn't lost anything. I had been given a second chance. A chance to rebuild, to start fresh, to figure out who I was outside of being Lorna's husband. And that was a gift. I met Patrick's gaze and smiled for real this time. Now, I said, stepping inside, feeling lighter than I had in years. Now, I start over. And just like that, the weight was gone.